1984 is about totalitarianism. A totalitarian government is one that tries to control every aspect of life. How people spend every minute of their time, even in private, who they can associate with, what they're allowed to say. A totalitarian government even tries to control what people think and what they believe. George Orwell wrote 1984 in the late 1940s. What he knew about totalitarianism was based on the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany. Those governments had come into being not that long before, and they weren't very well understood yet. What Orwell was trying to do with 1984 was to give his readers a clear picture of what life would be like if a free country like England were under totalitarian rule. 1984 takes place in London. The London in the book is a depressing place. There's never enough to eat, the food's disgusting, there aren't enough clothes or shoes or anything to go around, and the city is pretty dilapidated, except for these giant pyramid-shaped government buildings that rise above the landscape. There's some sort of war going on, though no one really understands what it's about. Rockets frequently explode in the streets and blow people to bits. The worst part is that the government is always watching everything people do. There are these posters of Big Brother, who's supposedly the leader of the government, that say, "Big Brother is watching you." There are thought police who have hidden cameras and microphones literally everywhere. The government can watch you in your home, through your TV screen, and you're not allowed to turn your TV off, ever. There are a lot of things you're not allowed to do in this society, and if you do them, the police might take you away and throw you into a forced labor camp. You're not allowed to have close friends, you're not allowed to be in love, you can't date or have sex with someone you like. You're basically supposed to save all your emotional energy for the party being the government. Then there are things you have to do. You have to watch the government programming on TV, most of its news, some of its exercises. You have to attend pep rallies, including this one called the 2 Minutes Hate. So it's hard to even have time to think your own thoughts, because they're constantly filling your head with propaganda. The main character of 1984 is Winston Smith. He's 39, he has a job in the government, and he lives this horrible, dreary existence without any friends or anyone in his life. At the beginning of the book, he starts writing a diary to talk about how much he hates life in his society, even though writing a diary is one of those things you'd be killed for doing if you were caught. The diary is his place for thinking about his society. It's a place where he tries to imagine if life could possibly be different from the way it is. There's no way for him to know if things were ever different before, because the government has changed all the records of the past and rewritten all the history books. At the beginning of the novel, there are two other people who matter to Winston, and he doesn't even know either of them. One of them is Julia. Julia is this attractive young woman who works in the same building as him. She's some kind of mechanic. Winston basically hates her. He hates her because she's pretty and he can't have her, but he also thinks she's the sort of person who would turn him into the thought police. So he's afraid of her, but also sort of fascinated. The other person he's interested in is this portly guy named O'Brien, who's a member of the inner party. That means he's a boss, much higher up than Winston. Winston should be afraid of this guy, but he gets the sense that O'Brien is intelligent, so he has this yearning to be friends with him. He thinks O'Brien would understand how he feels about life. The book takes a turn one day when Julia slips Winston a note that says, "I love you." This note completely rocks Winston's world. Of course he's interested. He can't wait to get in touch with her. But it's very hard for them to say 2 words to each other in private with all these spies and cameras everywhere. One who understands him and who hates the party as much as he does. But Winston needs to go that extra step. He's rebelling against the party privately by having the secret affair. Now he wants to go to the next level and be an active rebel against the government. He gets his chance one day, when O'Brien invites him to his apartment to look at something work-related. Winston takes a leap of faith and guesses that O'Brien must be part of the rebellion, because no one invites people over to their home. It just isn't done. So he and Julia go to O'Brien's house and confess that they want to be rebels, and O'Brien says, "Yes, I'm a rebel too," and we all read this book that explains why things are the way they are. Winston reads the book, and he's blown away by it. Unfortunately, right after he reads it, the thought police bust in and arrest him and Julia and carry them off to the Ministry of Love to torture them. So we learned that O'Brien wasn't a rebel after all. He just wanted to catch Winston. In the Ministry of Love, they torture Winston in all sorts of horrible ways. They break his bones in his teeth, they use electric shock, they starve him, and on and on. He tells them everything he knows, he confesses to everything they ask him, and he tells them everything he knows about Julia. After torturing him over and over, O'Brien finally tells Winston what it is that the government really wants. What they want is to have total power over the minds of people like Winston. They want people like Winston to say 2 + 2 = 5 and really believe it, not just say it to avoid a beating. For the government, it's purely an exercise in power. They're not trying to control his mind for some other purpose. They just want to exercise total power over people's minds. They finally do break Winston completely, in this place called Room 101, where they do whatever it is you're most afraid of. They lock his face into a cage and threaten to let these rats eat their way through his face. He has a phobia of rats, so he loses it and says, "Do it to Julia, not me," which is a complete betrayal of what's most important to him. The government has taken his last shred of integrity. After he does that, they let him and Julia go. The thought police don't care about them anymore. The two of them meet on the outside, but they can't love each other anymore. Winston and Julia are basically broken people after they get out. Winston has changed to the point that he doesn't even want to think about anything that might be rebellious. He just sits in a cafe listening to the news and smiling. The last words of the novel are, "He loved Big Brother." So, one of the points the book makes is that a human being can be broken down completely until he'll believe whatever you tell him, even if it's that 2 + 2 = 5. At the same time, the book has a positive message, which is that it's really hard to get inside someone's head to that extent. The government has to go to incredible lengths to brainwash Winston successfully. For more information about 1984...
Are we living in George Orwell's 1984? Possibly. Living today may be more disturbing than the dystopian novel could have predicted. George Orwell was a British novelist who penned 1984 over 67 years ago. Has a novel created more of an impact in conspiracy theories or legitimate political talk than 1984? In fact, Orwellian is such common talk that the Webster's New World College Dictionary claims it means of or like the society portrayed in his novel 1984, where a totalitarian government exercises total control of the public and private activities of the citizens. Despite being a condemnation of the Soviet totalitarianism, we can find 13 disturbing things in his novel going on here in the free world. Number 13. Like in 1984, the goal of world destruction is apparent, and history is rewritten as it's being done today. Artifacts and documentation from antiquity being systematically destroyed in the world's war zones. Books rewritten for school children, forcing them to think what they're told instead of how to think. Writers and actors producing so-called documentaries while taking massive historic liberties, banning the truth or embellishing it for consumption of mass entertainment. Number 12. Big Brother is watching. Police departments have equipment to read license plate numbers to check personal information as well as verification of registration and insurance. Citizens need licenses, school IDs, social security numbers, and zip codes to prove who they are. There are chips in our credit and bank cards for security purposes, making it far easier for the government to monitor transactions through the chip. The government assures they're flagged and notified by banks when deposits or withdrawals are too large. Student loans and financial aid for college is based upon recording every cent parents make. Gun ownership is monitored and we're asked to register all weapons in which we carry. Does this make it easier for Big Brother to come calling when it wants to ban weapons by force? Or to confiscate your monies during a national emergency? Number 11. The relation to 1984's telescreen. In the novel, there are telescreens on every corner which monitor citizens' actions as well as offer the 24/7 government release of propaganda, slanted news, and approved entertainment. Winston worries one day as he frowns in front of a telescreen. Did Big Brother witness it? Of course they did. He waits for them to confront him over it. Every knock on the door leaves him with pins and needles. On social media sites such as Facebook and Twitter, the government, corporations, as well as hackers monitor citizens' likes, dislikes, photos, and even private information. Citizens willingly tell the government their likes in food, politics, religion, sex, and consumer activities. Some wear fitness trackers which compile our personal and physical activity. Anyone can send this to a website to track their progress, and although the owners say the websites are safe, our information is being sold to data collecting agencies. Then, the government can pinpoint who is physically in shape and who isn't.
Number 10.
The never-ending war. After time passes and history is rewritten again, Winston is unable to tell who is a friend and who is a foe. While the novel takes place in totalitarian England, the enemies change constantly. No one can truly say for sure whom is their allies and whom they're fighting. The war never ends, strikingly similar to the wars we wage across the globe. There appears to be no end in sight, and often we're unable to exactly pinpoint who is the enemy.
Number 9.
Planned inflicted attacks to control the populace. Eventually, Winston learns the never-ending war may be a convoluted fabrication to keep the populace in a continual state of war. We see this internally in our nation at this point. Brother against brother, man against woman, woman against woman. Many of the enemies, like in 1984, do not exist. They're used to keep the populace in a perpetual state of fear to win their support for any war or police state type of action to keep the masses safe.
Number 8.
Mind control through paranoia, press, education, and language. In 1984, all citizens partake in a 2-minute hate session against the so-called enemy. This sounds very similar to our political process, where two parties hold a convention and come out spewing hate against the other party. We're expected to hate people of another group, color, or ancestry. We spew our own ills onto others in society, blaming them for our shortcomings. In 1984, Winston controls the flow of false information. We can see this in our news media. They control, along with the government, what they want us to hear. In the novel, they replace words to make them nicer, like we do in our educational system in order not to offend anyone. We allow the dumbing down of our students, many to the point where they can barely communicate without feeling fear, needing safe spaces in college, or anger as they question your beliefs. Students no longer think for themselves, but think what they were told.
Number 7.
Controlled resistance. When Winston's eyes open to the corruption of the nation, he realizes the government telling us which enemy to hate is a farce. He then joins a resistance group and eventually discovers even the so-called enemy is fabricated. The resistance is the government. Surely we can see the various protest groups arising and causing further division between the citizens. It's already infiltrated everything from sports, media, and remember 50 Shades of Grey? An almost laughable rendition of an abusive relationship sold to the massive audience as a love story. In 1984, Winston's love interest, Julia, works for Pornosac, which releases mindless, cheap, low-grade, boring pornography.
Number 5.
The breakup of the family. As Winston's lover, Julia may or may not love Winston, and he may or may not love her as well. They do not end up together. Why? As sex is only used for procreation, close relationships between men and women are frowned upon. This is birth rates, abortion rates, and the high rate of divorce are results of the mainstreaming of porno. Citizens are always easier to control when alone. The breakdown of the family captures many within the poverty cycle.
Number 4.
The thought police and the brainwashing of the populace. In 1984, many vile things which were banned in the past, such as hostage abuse, imprisonment without trial, make a roaring comeback in 1984 by those in power, as the government knows best. Any one person who stood out against the inequities of the past were silenced, as they are today. Unpopular or politically incorrect posts are attacked on social media. People lose jobs for an opinion or a religious belief. This is training us all to think the same, or at least silence our opinions until they exist no more.
Number 3.
Doublethink and newspeak. In 1984, doublethink is acceptance of two contradictory beliefs. A citizen accepts them and when acts upon them, does not feel guilt. This is brought about by newspeak, which take polar opposite words and force a relationship upon them. Doublethink is imperative to keep the party in power. Unfortunately, at the end of the novel, Winston succumbs to doublethink to make his life easier. He falls to the power of those in charge. In today's world, for example, massive anti-war protests can occur under one administration, and although a new party takes power and the war continues, the anti-war faction can disappear and no longer seek their right to protest against the war, and the conflicting belief does not bother them.
Number 2.
Betrayal, which is the manifestation of the thought police and doublethink combined. In 1984, since the family is an extension of the government, you feel no loyalty to it. You will gladly turn in members of your family when they break the laws. In today's world, one can look at the schools and programs such as DARE, which asks children to turn in their parents if they suspect any illegal substance, despite the fact that marijuana is being legalized around the world. A visit to a physician can warrant answers from children to questions such as, are there guns in your home? Do mom or dad drink alcohol? Do they smoke?
Number 1.
While it's not in Orwell's 1984, it is here. It's the blatant complacency of the people. In the novel, the government forced you to comply. Today, we freely offer our personal data for all to monitor and see. Privacy is gone. There are no longer any secrets. We indulge in the latest crazes such as Pokemon Go or the new tracking smart device. In 1984, there are the proles, the proletariats, or the working class. They can change the government of 1984, but they're busy consuming, watching, being brainwashed, and going to work. But they can still bring down the government portrayed in Orwell's 1984. We are the mass mentality, Orwell's proles. With our failure to act, our complacency, and shrug of the shoulder, we don't believe in government conspiracies and muddle through our lives as the government overextends its powers into all aspects of our lives, from media, news, education, and even the collection of rainwater. PC talk allows us to only say what is permitted or suffer the consequences of losing a job, being sent for corporate sensitivities classes, banned from social media, and shunned in our communities. All voices of dissent systematically forced into silence under the guise of PC talk. Is George Orwell's novel 1984 disturbing? It is. But today's climate is more precarious, as this is reality and not a fiction novel. In 1984, the proletariat had the oppressive force of the government thrust upon them against their will. Today, we willfully march on as sheep to the slaughter.
Hello, I'm Patrick Wanis, human behaviour and relationship expert, PhD. In the late 1940s, British author George Orwell wrote a book, 1984, and in that book, he predicted what is coming true today with Donald Trump. The German fascist leaders of the time had a saying: if you tell a lie often enough and loud enough, it becomes the truth. And the Stalinists did exactly that as they began to rewrite history to change facts, to try to change people's beliefs and perceptions about things that had actually occurred. And this is a key issue in the book 1984, the attempt to rewrite history. And that is exactly what Donald Trump today is doing when he says things such as,
because our African American communities are absolutely in the worst shape that they've ever been in before, ever, ever, ever.
By saying things such as this, Donald Trump is denying the existence of slavery. He's denying the suffering of the black people. In 1965, 65% of black children lived below the poverty line. Today, that number is around 30%. And between 1882 and 1931, 3,318 black people were lynched. The attempt to rewrite history is the attempt to control people. In the book 1984, the ruling party has a slogan: he who controls the past controls the future. He who controls the present controls the past. In other words, if you have sufficient power in the present, you can rewrite history to your advantage so you can control the people and control the future. And the more that Donald Trump does this, the more that his followers and supporters believe him and then do the same thing themselves. As exemplified by this woman, Kathy Miller, a representative from the Trump campaign in Ohio, who tells Paul Lewis from The Guardian the following.
What's your response to people who say that there is a just below the surface level of racism in America, and Donald Trump's candidacy has enabled that to just slip above the surface?
I don't think there was any racism until Obama got elected. And if you're black and you haven't been successful in the last 50 years, it's your own fault.
Thank you, ma'am. We really appreciate it.
You got it.
Thank you.
Not the racist. Get off that topic.
Yeah. You don't like that topic?
It doesn't. No, it's of no consequence.
What, racism?
No. Because if people have jobs and go to work and do what they're supposed to do, there is no racism.
Now notice again what she's doing. She's saying that prior to the presidency of a black man, there was no racism in America. And the solution to present-day racism, just put all the black people to work. Not only is she rewriting history, she's denying even the existence of the Ku Klux Klan.
This is the Klan Clud in action. The preacher, evangelist, the hellfire speaker, the rabble-rouser. He entertains with a mixture of comedy and Christianity. But above all, he preaches racial hatred.
Then you think children is brought up to mix the black and white together. Do you know your horse won't mix with your cow, your dog won't mix with your hog, and you tell me white people has got a mind and can't think no clearer than that?
All of these attempts to rewrite history, to make history mutable and changeable, are designed for one purpose alone: to control the people, to have power over the people. In other words, change history, rewrite it for convenience, for ideology, and ultimately for control and power over the people. And there is only one antidote to this. The only way to remain immune to the attempt to rewrite history is to continually keep revisiting history, to see history for the way it really was, for the way that it really is, and the way that it really always will be. I'm Patrick Wanis.
Dear Donald Trump, my name is Bana Al-Abid and I am 7 years old, Syrian girl from Aleppo. I am part of Syrian children who suffered. Some of my friends died. I am very sad about them. They are suffering because of adult people. I know you will be the President of America. If you promise me you will do something for the children of Syria, I am already your new friend.
U.S. President Donald Trump says he is keeping radical Islamic terrorists out and keeping America safe. Critics say he is trampling on the U.S. tradition of welcoming immigrants. Friday, Mr. Trump signed a sweeping order barring people from 7 predominantly Muslim nations from entering the U.S. for 3 months. Those countries, you see them there: Libya, Sudan, Somalia, Yemen, Syria, Iraq, and Iran. The order also suspends the U.S. refugee admissions program for 120 days. That's 4 months. The Syrian refugees are barred from the U.S. indefinitely. Also, people holding certain visas will now have to undergo in-person interviews in order to renew their visas. All right, Jim Acosta is joining us now, senior White House correspondent. Jim, Donald Trump campaigned on controlling borders and a tougher vetting of people coming into the U.S. He's delivering on that promise.
That's right, Cyril, he is. But make no mistake, these are some very sweeping actions coming from the new president. He signed this executive order earlier in the day over at the Pentagon. We just got our hands on the executive order. This is it right here. But the actions are fairly dramatic. He's talking about suspending visas for people coming into the United States from 7 countries that have links to terrorism. Iran, Iraq, Syria, the Sudan, Somalia are among those 7 countries. Those visas have been suspended for 90 days as part of this action. They're also implementing what they're referring to as extreme vetting methods for people coming into the United States from terror-prone parts of the world. That would include biometric scanning, a more lengthy interview process. It's going to be a much more draconian step that's being taken here as part of that extreme vetting process. And then I think the part that is really going to send shockwaves around the world, and that is the suspension of the U.S. refugee program. This is for political refugees, religious refugees coming into the United States. That program is suspended for 120 days while they get these new measures up and running. And permanently ended by the Trump administration is the Syrian refugee program, which was bringing in people from that part of the world under the Obama administration. That program now ends, and so you will not have Syrian refugees coming into this country as part of this executive order. So it is a very sweeping decision coming from the president.
Jim, you mentioned religious refugees. During the campaign, Donald Trump raised a lot of eyebrows and got a lot of criticism for advocating a ban on Muslims entering the U.S. To what extent is this executive order a Muslim ban?
Well, all of the countries listed in that temporary ban on those visas coming into the country for 90 days, those are all Muslim-majority countries. And so you have critics already coming out and making statements about this. Senator Kamala Harris from California, she's a brand-new senator, but she's been talked about as a potential 2020 candidate in the next election. If you can believe it, we're still talking about that, even though Donald Trump has just entered the White House. But she said, make no mistake, in a statement tonight, this is a Muslim ban. The Senate, those 7 countries may not be all of them. We've been talking to White House officials this evening who said that there may be more countries added to this list. And so make no mistake, this is a very aggressive action that's being taken by the Trump administration. They talk at length during this executive order, at the top of this executive order, about 9/11, something that occurred 16 years ago. And so President Trump campaigned during that election cycle as someone who was going to crack down and ramp up the war on terrorism, the war on ISIS. And this is just the beginning of that process, I think.
All right, joining us live now from Washington, D.C. is Zainab Chowdhury, a spokeswoman for the Council on American-Islamic Relations, and from Philadelphia, we're joined by Joe Watkins, a Republican strategist and former White House aide to George H.W. Bush. Welcome to you both, and thanks for being with us here on the Al Jazeera News Hour. Joe Watkins, perhaps if I could come to you first. How does banning all people from 7 predominantly Muslim countries, how does that protect people in the United States?
Well, I'm not convinced that it does necessarily, but Donald Trump is now president of the United States. He was elected. He won the election in the Electoral College, which makes him the president, and his supporters gave him a mandate to do something about terrorism. He had earlier during the campaign talked about a ban on Muslims, which I never agreed with, of course, coming into the country. And now that he's president of the United States, he's issued this executive order, which gives him a period of time to formulate a policy with regards to how to deal with the issue of people coming from those 7 countries. And so he certainly deserves to have to formulate a policy that works. Now, I may not agree with the policy, and there may be others that don't agree with it as well, but nonetheless, he does deserve time to formulate a policy. And as President of the United States, he does have the right to make good on some of his campaign promises, whether we agree with them or not. So that's what he's doing.
All right, coming back to you in a moment. Dr. Zainab Chowdhury, thanks for being with us. It's not going to be a permanent ban. It's going to be a temporary ban in some cases, and the president has the right to do this if he wants to protect his people.
You know, as an American, as a Muslim, and as a civil rights activist, I've been deeply disturbed listening to reports of not only just refugees and immigrants who have been impacted by this executive order, but also by Americans who've also been, who've been impacted on a very real level. A week ago, Donald Trump stood in front of the nation and he pledged to be a president for all Americans. He took the oath of office to uphold the values of the Constitution, the rights that are enshrined in the U.S. Constitution. And in the days since that, he's been systematically implementing executive orders and policies that have undermined many of the rights that have been enshrined in that very Constitution, and it's deeply disturbing.
Have you heard stories of people who are now in limbo because of this executive order?
We have, absolutely. We've been receiving reports of, for example, one gentleman was not able to travel to to Iran to bury his mother, who passed away 3 days ago now because of the news of the executive order, the impending executive order at that time. And he was advised by his attorney to not travel abroad to Iran to bury his mother because he's not a citizen. He's a green card holder. We've also heard reports of students who are here on a student visa who are afraid to travel outside of the United States because they don't know if they'll be granted reentry. There's a case of a woman in Yemen who is 75 years old. She was at the airport expecting to board the plane just a couple hours before Donald Trump signed the executive order to come to the United States and meet her new grandson, a newborn grandson, and the family was at the airport, and they were, they contacted us letting us know that their grandmother was unable to board the plane. She was banned, and she was sitting in the airport not knowing what to expect, 75 years old. And these are some of the very real, very tangible consequences of this kind of ideology, not even policy, ideology, that's really instilled a lot of anxiety and I think concern in many Americans' hearts.
Yes. Joe Watkins, many people who are opposed to this executive order say it's simply demonizing a religion.
Yeah, well, clearly, I don't think the president would want to do that. You don't want to demonize a religion. The United States has never been at war with a religion, and clearly we have millions of Americans who are Muslims. I have members of my family who are Muslim, of course, who I love and whose religion I respect. And I think that would be the same for the president. I think that he is searching for a way to get the issue of terror and people coming into the country under control. He pledged that during his campaign. He pledged to take some harsh measures to get it under control. This is perhaps a difficult measure, at the least, for many people who wish to come here, who wish to find refuge in the United States. But nonetheless, it's a policy that he's enacted, at least as an executive order, to give himself a period of time to come up with a policy to better control the flow of people into the country and to make sure that terrorists aren't entering the United States.
I mean, Joe, how worried are you? You say that you don't particularly agree with the policy. How worried are you that the rest of the world's view of the US as the leader of the free world, that view is now changing since President Trump arrived in the White House?
Well, the United States is a country of immigrants. I mean, everybody in the country is somebody whose family comes from abroad, and I've got family all over the world, of course, and I've traveled all over the world and have many friends all around the world. That's the case for most Americans. Most Americans are just 1 or 2 generations away from somebody who came here to this country looking for freedom. And so from that standpoint, it's made it a little bit more difficult, at least for the people that would come here to this country from those 7 countries that were outlined in the executive order. It doesn't say that's the case for every country in the world, but certainly for those 7 countries, he wants to take time, President Trump wants to take time to evaluate and to figure out a policy that he thinks will be fair and that will better protect Americans from the inflow of possible terrorists. And so this is what he's chosen to do. There'll be some people that'll be certainly put out of sorts because of this. I mean, there will be some people like the ones you've heard mentioned who will miss flights, who won't be able to bury loved ones, who won't be able to travel as they may have planned to. But nonetheless, this is the executive order that this president has signed, and he's giving himself a number of days to get a policy together.
And a final thought to you, Zainab Chowdhury. How confident are you that the outcry, the outrage that we've seen around the world and from within the United States, are you confident that perhaps things could change more quickly, that that executive order could be changed more quickly, that it'll be removed more quickly than it first fears that it's going to be?
We're banking on it. I mean, this is something that, we know on the campaign trail, Donald Trump pledged to call for a complete and total shutdown of Muslims entering the United States. And so to now say that religion is not a factor in these kind of policies or ideologies that are perpetuating this hatred against the Muslim world and further dividing our country is a mistake. It's a huge mistake, and it's infactual. Religion absolutely has a huge role to play. Islamophobia, anti-Muslim bigotry, the against Muslims, the machine that perpetuates Islamophobia in the United States and globally has a huge role to play in these kind of discriminatory policies that isolate an entire group of people based on their religion. I think that time will tell if this is something that's going to be rolled back, but activists and lawyers, attorneys are committed to doing everything we can to pushing back against these kind of policies. Our Constitution does not allow the discrimination against any minority group or any group based on race, religion, gender orientation, or sexual orientation, or what have you. And the idea that now we have Americans who are concerned about traveling outside of the United States, we have people who are abroad who are afraid that they're not going to be able to re-enter the United States to come home to be with their loved ones, is something that I think it's not who we are. It cannot be who we are. And we must continue to work together against these policies to make sure that no American ever feels that they're going to be discriminated against because of their religion.
All right, Zainab Chowdhury and Joe Watkins, really appreciate you both coming onto the programme. Thanks so much for your time. Thank you.
Number 9.
Planned inflicted attacks to control the populace. Eventually, Winston learns the never-ending war may be a convoluted fabrication to keep the populace in a continual state of war. We see this internally in our nation at this point. Brother against brother, man against woman, woman against woman. Many of the enemies, like in 1984, do not exist. They're used to keep the populace in a perpetual state of fear to win their support for any war or police state type of action to keep the masses safe.
Number 8.
Mind control through paranoia, press, education, and language. In 1984, all citizens partake in a 2-minute hate session against the so-called enemy. This sounds very similar to our political process, where two parties hold a convention and come out spewing hate against the other party. We're expected to hate people of another group, color, or ancestry. We spew our own ills onto others in society, blaming them for our shortcomings. In 1984, Winston controlled. Are we living in George Orwell's 1984? Possibly. Living today may be more disturbing than the dystopian novel could have predicted.
Is to fly over the rainbow so high. My dream is to fly